So last week we discussed the division of the Roman Empire into eastern and western halves. And this, of course, begins as a process that we start seeing in pieces starting as early as the 2nd century. But sooner or later, each time the empire divided, some emperor came and reunified it. And this continued from the first imperial divisions of the 160s all the way through the reign of this person, Theodosius I. Theodosius I was the last Roman emperor to unify control over both the East and the West. And he held this unified control for a little less than a year. So Theodosius unified the two parts of the empire in the year 394, and he died in 395. And after his death, East and West never came back together again under one person's control. Now, as we saw last time, the West was divided up between a number of larger barbarian kingdoms in the 5th century, as well as a number of smaller ones too. So there's our map, more or less at the time of Theodosius' death. And that division was something that more or less held until in the 6th century, the East came back. Now, why was the East secure while the West was not? Well, there are a number of reasons for this. I mean, one is that the territory in the East was richer than the territory in the West. And when the territory in the East didn't have to pay for the administration of the territory in the West, this helped it along quite a bit. And so by the time the year 500 rolls around, the East is rich, powerful, and far more advanced than a lot of the West. And this is why in the 530s, the Emperor Justinian is able to go back to the West and conquer territory in Italy and in Spain and in North Africa. But as we also saw, Justinian and the Romans never get back to what's now France. They never confront the Franks in any sort of campaign in Frankish territory. And so the Frankish successor state, the fourth of those great barbarian states in the West, survives. Now, the Eastern superiority to the West was challenged in the 7th century on a couple of levels. I mean, the first of these was that massive war between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire that began in the 560s and lasted off and on through basically 630. And that war weakened the East, it depleted its resources, it depleted its military, and the significance of that war was not just the battles between the Romans and the Persians, but the fact that after that war concluded, both the Romans and the Persians were exhausted. And that is exactly the moment when Arab Muslim armies start coming out of Arabia and inflicting defeats on both the Romans and the Persians. Now, by the early 640s, the entire Persian Empire was conquered. Arab forces came in, rolled all the way through what's now Iraq and Iran, into Pakistan and Afghanistan. And the Roman forces survive, but with massive losses as well. So the Roman Empire loses Syria in 636, it loses Egypt in 642, it loses North Africa by 700, and then in 717 and 718, the capital of Constantinople is put under siege for an entire year by Arab forces. Now, last week we saw how Roman weakness in the 8th century and Frankish assertiveness sort of combined to shift the power dynamic in the Mediterranean. So the Roman losses weakened the empire so much that the Franks came to seem like a real alternative to the Romans. But that's where we left off. We left off basically in the early 9th century. And at that moment, the Frankish kingdom of Charlemagne does very much look like an alternative, a significant alternative, where the West can present itself as equal to the East, at least in a number of ways. But Charlemagne is crowned Roman Emperor at a really, really unique moment in history. Because the Eastern Romans, which many people in the modern world now call the Byzantines, had begun punching back against the Arabs in the 8th century. After the siege of Constantinople was lifted in 718, the Byzantine armies go on the offensive, and by the 740s, they're even able to start taking some territory back. But they do it under a religious system that believed that churches could contain no images of Christ, or saints or any other religious figures. And this is an idea that to especially Italians and the Pope was heretical. It was just not appropriate Christian ways of thinking. And then when the East drops its objections to religious images, the person who does this is not an emperor, but an empress. Basileus Irene, meaning Empress Irene. And you see Irene on the right here. Now, the assertion of power by Irene is novel. There had been many women who have exercised effective power in the Roman state. This goes all the way back to, we can see, for example, the mother of the Emperor Nero exercising power in his name. But Irene is different because Irene is not exercising power in anyone's name. Irene is the power in the state. And this is a remarkable change, but it's a change that provides an opening in the West to alter the status of that Roman Empire. And so this is a text that's written in the early 9th century at a time when Charlemagne was looking to begin a war against the East. And this is his rationale for why Charlemagne can be called Roman Emperor. He says, since the title of emperor had become extinct among the Greeks, and a woman, Empress Irene, claimed imperial authority, it seemed to Pope Leo and all of the Holy Fathers who were present at the council and to the rest of the Christian people that Charles, the king of the Franks, ought to be named emperor, for he held Rome itself, where the Caesars were always accustomed to reside, and also other cities in Italy, Gaul, and Germany. And since Almighty God had put all these places in his power, it seemed fitting to them that with the help of God, and in accordance with the request of all Christian people, he should hold this title. And King Charles did not wish to refuse this petition, and so humbly submitting himself to God and to the petition of all the Christian priests and peoples, he accepted the title of emperor on Christmas and was consecrated by Pope Leo. Now this is where we left off, with Charlemagne leading the West to a point where Frankish Catholic kings felt they were equals with the Romans in the East. And what you can see here is how kind of tortured this logic is. The people in the West acknowledge there is still a Roman Empire. But what they say is because there's a woman in charge of that empire, it's no longer actually a Roman Empire because there's no emperor in charge. And if there's no emperor in charge, well, why not give the imperial title and the status of Roman Empire to his kingdom, to Charlemagne's kingdom, because he, after all, holds the city of Rome. And so what does it matter if there are people who claim to be Romans? If they're led by a woman, they can't actually claim imperial authority, and therefore imperial authority is vacant and the Pope can bestow it on Charlemagne. So in 800, this might seem like it makes some sense. The West might seem like it's supplanting the East in terms of the more powerful and authoritative Roman claiming empire in the world. But this isn't the end of the story, because Charlemagne is like a rock that appears only at low tide. His reign represents the brief fleeting moment between 800 and 1200 where Western state was possibly more powerful than the Roman East. And for the next 200 years, we see the East rise while the West falls back. So Charlemagne's son took power from him, but he is struggling for most of his reign to hold on to the power and the unified sort of authority that Charlemagne had given him, to the point where at various points in his life, Louis is held captive by his own sons as they struggle to challenge his role and rule over that Western Roman Empire. And while this is happening in the West, the empire becomes clearly unable to deal with a lot of the threats coming from outside, including, of course, Viking raids and other things that begin impacting this Western Roman Empire in the 9th century. But while this is all happening in the West, the Byzantine Empire in the East recovers, and it emerges again as the strongest Mediterranean power under a dynasty called the Macedonian dynasty. Now, the Macedonian dynasty lasts from 867 until the 1050s, but it really reached its height under the reign of the Emperor Basil II. And under the Macedonian emperors, Rome again becomes able to project power. So it reconquered from Arab Muslim forces Crete, Syria, and even parts of what's now Lebanon. And it campaigned deep into Arab territory and got at one point to within almost a day's march of Jerusalem. It also expanded its power north to the Danube River for the first time in almost 400 years, and east into Armenia for the first time in almost 700 years. And so the picture that we have in the Annals of Lorsch of an Eastern empire that is kind of fading into irrelevance reverses, and it reverses within the lifetime of a lot of the people who were young when Charlemagne was given this imperial power. And so a Roman resurgence in the East makes people think differently about how one understands the relative position of Roman empires and Roman imperial authorities. And this is all very important. And it's something that the Macedonian dynasty rightly gets credit for doing. But it's also important to emphasize that the most effective members of the Macedonian dynasty came later in the 10th and 11th centuries. And our subject today, the Emperor Basil I, is actually the most important member of the dynasty, not because of what he accomplished, but because he is the person who founded the dynasty. And in fact, when you look back at Basil's life and career, it doesn't look terribly good. He doesn't look like the kind of figure that you particularly would want to be honoring. And there are a number of reasons for this. The biggest one is that Basil was elevated into office by the regime of a child emperor named Michael III, who is called by Basil's apologists Michael the Drunkard. But Michael was actually not a drunkard, and certainly he wasn't a drunkard when he took power as a 5-year-old in 843 AD. He was assisted by very capable and powerful advisors, and with their help, he began to turn around the imperial tide. So in 844, for example, his forces briefly retook Crete before being forced out again by the Egyptian navy. In 853, he orchestrated a raid to punish these Egyptians by actually sending ships to the mouth of the Nile and burning down an Egyptian port. And this was the first time Byzantine armies had set foot in Egypt in over 200 years. But he really came into his own in 856, when a coup allowed him to replace a group of advisors with his uncle, a man named Bardas. And Bardas was a remarkably capable figure. He chartered a university in Constantinople, he patronized the arts, he patronized intellectual life, but he also helped steer imperial military policy in positive directions so that the empire retook land from the Arabs and pushed Byzantine frontiers back to their historic eastern limit, the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. He also fundamentally put the Arabs on their heels, and following a great victory in 863, Byzantium would spend much of the next century and a half on the offensive against the Arabs. But one could not look at Bardas' service as anything but exemplary, and one could not in any way suspect Michael of being an ineffectual emperor. They seemed like people who had at least earned the ability to live out their lives serving the empire and running the empire. So it's surprising to learn that they would both end up dead, assassinated not even 5 years after the great military victory of 863. And this happened simply because they put their trust in the wrong person. And that person was Basil I. Now, not only did Basil take power by orchestrating the assassination of Michael and Bardas, but he was also far, far less successful than they were in running the empire. So he wasn't able to follow up on the victories Michael had won against the Arabs. His forces suffered defeats in other areas, and his greatest foreign policy initiative was to try to combine forces with the Frankish heirs of Charlemagne for a campaign against the Arabs in some of the islands of the Mediterranean. But this actually came to nothing. The one really true military achievement that he had was to win a civil war, and that's all fine as far as it goes. But that's nothing compared to what his immediate predecessor had done. But Basil was the founder of a long-lasting dynasty, and his heirs continued to run the empire long after Basil died. And so this means that Basil, even though he's not a particularly honorable person and not a particularly successful emperor, he becomes an exemplary figure that people want to think positively about. And this brings us to Genesios' life of Basil. This text was apparently commissioned by the Emperor Constantine VII, the grandson of Basil, and it was written around the year 950, about 85 years after Basil died. Now, we don't know very much about Genesius. It seems he was a nobleman who was born to a wealthy family in Armenia sometime around the turn of the 10th century. He'd already written lives of the emperors who preceded Basil, including a particularly cutting takedown of the Emperor Michael III, but he apparently had finished this project in the 920s. And so it appears that he was later commissioned to pick up that project again and write about Basil in part as a continuation. So the Emperor Constantine VII, of course, had a natural interest in trying to make his grandfather look good, because as the founder of the dynasty, Basil mattered a great deal, not only for sort of sentimental reasons, but also because this helped underpin Constantine's own claim to power. But we also have to respect the difficulty of Genesius' task. It's really hard to make a peasant who murdered a successful emperor and then did a mediocre job running the empire look like an ideal ruler. But Genesius did his best. And there's really three significant goals that he tries to advance in the text. First, he wants to argue that Basil, as the founder of the ruling dynasty, was worthy of being emperor. Second, he wants to show that Basil took power legitimately. And then third, he wants to highlight the positive accomplishments that Basil had. And each of these is difficult for a different reason. The biggest challenge was arguing that Basil was worthy of being emperor, because everybody knew that Basil's family was basically a group of refugees who had come from Armenia and been forced to settle in Macedonia in the early decades of the 800s. They were peasants who had been forced to move by the Emperor Nicephorus in an effort to make Christian populations settle in the newly reconquered province of Macedonia that at that point was not majority Christian. Another source tells us that Basil was actually the son of poor peasants who had been unable to bring any possessions with them when they were resettled. But despite that fact, Genesius introduces and basically manufactures out of thin air a noble family background for Basil. So Basil, we're told, prided himself on being a descendant of the Parthian king Arsaces the Elder, but also of Tiridates, the king of the same line. But he was also the descendant of the excellent rulers Philip and Alexander. Born in Macedonia to parents of no small repute, he was raised by them just like Achilles by the centaur Chiron. Now this is a really remarkable claim, because what Genesius is doing is he's basically tying Basil to the most notable people ever to come out of the particular regions that Basil is tied to. So Basil's family came from Armenia. Everybody knows this. So who are the most prominent people from Armenia? Well, the Parthian king Arsaces the Elder is the founder of the great dynasty that confronted and held off the Romans for the better part of almost 300 years. And also Tiridates, who is the Armenian king who converted to Christianity. And so what Genesius is doing is he's taking the two most notable figures from the region that Basil's family ultimately came from and saying Basil's descended from them on the basis of absolutely nothing. But Genesius says he's also descended from the excellent rulers Philip and Alexander the Great. Now, that's not possible because Alexander had one child who died young and had no grandchildren. So there are no descendants of Alexander the Great. But of course, that doesn't matter either, because Basil was from Macedonia, and associating him with the most prominent people to come from Macedonia is, again, a step, a nice sort of creative fiction, just like tying him to these noble people from Armenia. And of course, we have his birth, then we have his background, his educational background. He was born in Macedonia, and he was raised by these wonderful parents, just like Achilles by the centaur Chiron. And so what we have here is a completely manufactured background for Basil. Now, it's a background that anybody reading a biography will expect to see. You know, the king with the wonderful connections to royal lines, who comes from great family, and has a wonderful education. But it's completely fictional. It is completely made up. But in a sense, that doesn't matter. This family background and stellar education just kind of sets the scene for the larger portrait that Genesius wants to write. And so he next turns to how Basil established himself. Genesius tells us that Basil was a huge and powerful man, and he came to the attention of the Emperor Michael because of his success in a wrestling contest. And Michael then brought Basil into imperial service. So he appointed Basil the head of his cavalry escort, and he gave Basil a wild horse to tame, which he loved greatly. And here's actually a picture of Basil taming that wild horse. Basil mounted it as Alexander had once bravely mounted Bucephalus, and he astounded all who witnessed the act. And after this, imperial favor toward him increased greatly. And he was soon honored by the title of patrician, given a beautiful wife from the noble family of Inger, and was afterwards adopted by the emperor as his successor. Now, of course, this is, again, quite interesting. The idea that Basil was selected to serve as the head of the cavalry escort of the emperor and given this wild horse, this is, as you can see, directly supposed to remind you of Alexander the Great. And so again, what Genesius is doing is he is giving you a model for how to understand Basil. And when Basil shows this Alexander-like quality, then he is brought into imperial service, he's given an imperial title, he is given a wife from one of the most prominent and powerful families in the empire, and then he's adopted by the emperor as his successor. Now, not coincidentally, the beautiful wife from the noble family of Inger was the emperor's former mistress. And so the idea here, I think, is not hard to understand. The mistress of the emperor is given in marriage to the emperor's closest associate. And so if the emperor wanted to see this mistress, it was just a natural thing that he would. But what Michael didn't understand is that the beautiful wife from the noble family of Inger might end up being more loyal to Basil than she was to Michael. And this is part of what happens. And once Basil is in court, he begins stirring up trouble with some assistance from the beautiful wife from the noble family of Inger. Basil soon began a series of plots through which he would take control of the state. The first figure against whom he worked was Bardas, the formidable figure who had actually directed policy for Michael and was at the heart of a lot of the greatest successes of Michael's reign. Now, in the midst of the initial stages of a campaign to retake Crete, Basil personally killed Bardas while Bardas sat next to Michael. And you'd think Michael might start to suspect this, might become a little alarmed or concerned. But he didn't. And he instead allowed Basil to take Bardas's place as the main advisor behind the throne. And then in 866, Basil got himself appointed co-emperor with Michael. And over the next year, Basil began working to build support and build people who were willing to participate in a coup. And in 867, he has Michael killed. Now, we can, I think, all agree that this is one of the best blindsides in history. And this is one of the most remarkable and bloodthirsty rises to power. But all of these things that Basil did are thoroughly disreputable things to do. They're certainly not in keeping with the idea of Basil that Genesius had been hired to promote. Ideal figures are not supposed to kill their benefactors. They're certainly not supposed to do it personally. And so this gets to the second of Genesius' tasks. He has to explain how it is that Basil's murders of Bardas and Michael, two men who literally raised him up from nothing, could possibly be justified. And again, this is a difficult problem, but Genesius again gives it his best shot. So he describes things in this way. He says, Michael's confidence in Basil continued to grow and roused the envy of a great many, who now conspired to destroy the harmony and love between Basil and Michael. They persuaded Michael that he would be violently killed by Basil, and Basil that he would suffer the same fate at the hands of Michael. Now, some people say that Michael was absolutely resolved to kill Basil, and that when the two of them went hunting together, he ordered someone to strike Basil with a spear. But others say that matters were not like that at all, and that Michael continued to be favorably disposed towards Basil. Now, those who supported Basil urged him to kill the emperor, but as they could not persuade him, because he continued to look favorably upon Michael, or, and this is remarkable, because the thought of murder made him swoon, to say nothing of the fact that he's already murdered many times, these people undertook to kill Michael themselves, fearing that otherwise they would be killed along with Basil. Now, it's really remarkable to see what Genesius has done here. He says that enmity starts arising. Anger, hatred, suspicion starts arising between Michael and Basil, not because of the two of them, but because people are conspiring to create it. And so some people tell Michael that he's going to be killed by Basil. Some people tell Basil he's going to be killed by Michael. Some people say that this is actually true. Some people say that it's not true. I don't really know, Genesius says. But what we do know is that Basil did not kill Michael. Instead, people around Basil killed Michael because they were afraid that they would be killed if Basil was killed. So this is of course absurd. Basil of course arranged to have Michael killed just as he had killed Bardas. But what Genesius has managed to do here is he's made the situation so completely confusing that nobody would actually think Basil would do this. It's just a major misunderstanding. Nobody actually knows what happened. Nobody knows if Basil wanted to kill Michael or Michael wanted to kill Basil or both of them wanted to kill each other. Some people say one thing, other people say other things. But what we can say for sure is that the thought of murder made Basil swoon. And therefore, Basil is not responsible for killing Michael. It's people around Basil who are responsible for killing Michael because they were afraid that they might be killed if Basil was killed. And this is completely absurd. But what it does is it sheds so much doubt on what happened and why it happened and who is responsible for it happening that you begin to think, well, I don't know what happened, but maybe Basil is justified in killing Michael. At the very least, though, the death of Michael can't be anything that causes one to look badly upon Basil. Because, frankly, how could you hold Basil responsible in a situation that's so complicated and so convoluted and so impossible to reconstruct? And so that's how Genesius has answered point number 2. But the third real challenge for Genesius is to then point to some significant things that Basil accomplished. And this is actually as much of a problem as the other two tasks, because Basil's biggest policy initiative was a combined Western Roman and Byzantine assault on Arab positions in the central Mediterranean, in large part because Basil had lost the island of Sicily, and the island of Sicily was becoming a base for Arab attacks against Roman positions and also Italian positions. And he'd hoped to line up the Carolingian emperor and fight alongside him with the reconquered territory going back to the Byzantines, but this basically went nowhere. Western forces did some damage, but they didn't return any cities to the Byzantines, and the Arabs in the meantime moved against the Byzantine island of Malta in response and took it from the empire. And then, in 878, Basil lost control of the city of Syracuse, the last remaining territory on Sicily that belonged to the Romans. And so his western campaigns resulted in a net loss for the empire. And in the east, things were only a little bit better. So Basil had managed to build somewhat on Michael's advances into Arab territory, but only somewhat. The most impressive victory he won was instead against a group of people called the Paulicians, a group of heretical rebels who were threatening to pull large segments of Asia Minor from imperial control. And as usual, the perspective that Genesius gives us on Basil's achievements is remarkable for how much it exaggerates what Basil did. The Paulician raids, we're told, reached as far as Nicomedia and Nicaea, two of the major cities in the northwestern part of Asia Minor. But he also moved against the Thracian, the area across the Bosporus in Thrace near Constantinople. And so the emperor wrote to this rebel and promised peace, but the arrogant infidel wasn't persuaded. He said, if you want to make peace with me, renounce your eastern possessions and content yourself with your western ones, meaning split the empire in two. And Genesius says, well, Basil then defeated these arrogant people as he was aided by both God and the experience of his generals. And so Genesius then gives us a nice moralizing tale of a calm, peaceful emperor facing down a horrible, arrogant heretic and defeating him through superior generalship and divine support. And this is the end of the campaign, where we see that at the end of this, the general destroys and kills the rebel leader. Now, in practice, this war was a very brutal thing. It was much more hard fought, and the victory was much more overwhelming. It was not at all merciful. And so this particular account is a way of basically wrapping up a really difficult set of circumstances that Basil did prevail in, but did prevail in with a great deal of brutality and not much mercy at all. The life, though, then moves on to a larger summary of Basil's other virtues, and some of these Genesius has to manufacture. So, for example, Genesius tells us that Basil decreed that his successors were to be Leo, a man who was ultimately known to history as Leo the Wise, the most famous and noble emperor, and after him his brother Alexander. But malicious men managed to curb natural affection, and Basil's fatherly love for Leo cooled a little. But the attacks were cut short, as there was no substance to them, and the informants were exiled. And Leo succeeded to the throne, and being a wise and noble man, he carried out the instructions of his father. So the story, according to Genesios, is really, if you don't know the actual reality, it's kind of strange. It sounds like Basil appointed Leo to be his successor. There were rumors about Leo being not particularly loyal to Basil, so Basil, his fatherly love for Leo cooled a little bit, but ultimately the informants were found to be spreading false rumors. They were exiled, and Leo succeeded to the throne, and because he was a wise ruler, he carried out the instructions of his father. Now, the real story here is quite interesting. Leo the Wise is the father of Constantine VII, the emperor who asked Genesius to write the biography of Basil. And when Basil's love for Leo cooled a little, what actually happened was Basil had Leo arrested, he put him in prison, and he held him in prison for 3 years. 3 years for high treason. So it's interesting to see what Genesius has done here. He's taken something that is a horrible blight on this emperor. The fact that he imprisoned his own son on spurious charges for 3 years. And he's made it sound like Leo spilled coffee on the table and Basil got upset and yelled at him for it. This seems like absolutely nothing. It seems like a very small spat between two ideal and wonderful rulers. But in reality, the situation is much different. Leo is an ideal and wonderful ruler, but Basil is not. And Basil doesn't behave that way with Leo in this circumstance. Instead, the reality of the situation is Basil is paranoid and he overreacts and does an incredible injustice to a son who neither deserved it nor actually should have had any penalty inflicted on him at all. In fact, in reality, Leo is a far better and far more honorable ruler than Basil was. But Genesius is not writing the reign of Leo. He's not writing the life of Leo. He's writing the life of Basil, and therefore the comparison between Leo and Basil cannot be so lopsided. Instead, Leo and Basil are both good. And Basil's mistake here wasn't in being so paranoid he imprisoned his own son. It was in listening to the wrong people, and as soon as he realized that those people were wrong, he very quickly corrected his mistake. Except the mistake lasted for 3 years, and it was not very quickly corrected. And so in Genesius' version of the incident, Basil's virtue is something that comes forward. But in reality, of course, this is not the act of a virtuous person. Not at all. Now, at times, though, Genesius is able to point to some real virtues. So we're told that the emperor was very good about going into the tax bureau and checking to be sure that the accounts were balanced correctly, which I guess is a virtue of a sort. We're also told that he was a highly competent hunter, and he could throw a spear, and he was a weightlifter, and he was a jumper, and he could hunt better than a centaur, and he could throw spears farther than the athletes of King Alcinous, and he could wrestle better than Aristeus and Ajax, and was even the equal of Hercules in wrestling, and he could jump higher than Achilles, and he could lift weights with his hands more easily than Hector. Now, these are names you probably recognize from last quarter. What Genesius is doing here is he is comparing Basil directly with people from the Iliad. Alcinous was in the Odyssey, but Aristeas, Ajax is in the Iliad, and Hercules, of course, was a Greek hero. And Achilles and Hector are both central characters in the Iliad. And the paragraph then goes on to include a bunch of other Homeric references, including a 3-line long quote from the Iliad that compares Basil's strength to that of Hector. And then follows even more legendary Greek heroes that are referenced in this text. So why does Genesius do this? Well, it's interesting to compare Genesius's move, inserting and comparing Basil with these figures from Homeric antiquity, and Einhard's really self-conscious use of Roman examples to discuss Charlemagne. The reason that Genesius uses these classical references is different from why Einhard includes them. For Einhard, Charlemagne belongs to a new age, in which the echoes of the Roman past are important because it shows that the new age, finally, after centuries, measures up to the old. But in the Constantinople of Genesius, the Roman Empire never fell. The classical world never ended. These Homeric references and the references to Alexander the Great and the Persian kings and all of these other things that Genesius is doing to situate Basil in a world that is connected to the classical past is not in any way designed to convince you that the New Age represents a return to the classical past, because the classical past never left. This is because the Byzantine world of Genesius remained directly tied to the classical world. These references are not echoes of a glorious past that had ended in the way that Einhard does with Charlemagne. These are references to a living, breathing literary culture that never went away. And so Einhard gives you a literary museum filled with the fossils of Cicero and Suetonius that he has brought back to life in a way. But Genesius gives you a petting zoo in which the classical past of Plato and Homer and Alexander the Great continues to live. It has never died, and you can engage with it as you always could, because the world remains continuously connected back to that world of Homer and that world of Alexander and that world of Plato. Because for Byzantium, that world never went away. And Genesius's Life of Basil shows how Byzantine authors continued to use that world and their connection to it for as long as the empire lasted.